So just doing the rounds. Thank you all so much for joining. We are going to be a few minutes here while we wait for folks to join. I'm going to put the agenda in the chat again. At the top of the agenda, there's a link to a sign-in sheet. If you would be so kind as to fill that out, just put some info there so we have a record of who came. That would be really, really wonderful. I'm probably getting started around 7:05, 7:06. We'll see how many folks jump in the next few minutes. But thank you for deciding to spend your Friday evening with us.
Oh, God, it was Friday.
Yeah, really.
Rule on the merits of this case, because at present the case is riddled with contingencies and speculation that impede.
Yeah, sorry. Just another point of like just Zoom practice. If folks could please mute, that'd be wonderful.
Hey, Michelangelo.
Yeah.
Some of us can't see the agenda in the chat.
Really? Let me.
Yeah, I'm not seeing.
Hold on. Let me take a look here. Let me change this. Try pasting it again.
Oh, I think you somehow sent it to the waiting room, not to the main room.
Really? Oh, okay. All right, hold on.
Yeah, I see the same thing.
All right. Apologies, folks. Let's try that. There we go. All right, so I'll repeat that again. There's a sign-in sheet at the top of the agenda. If everyone could please fill that out, that would be great. Oh, I know. It's a very nice t-shirt. It's union made. All right, here, hold on. Got to get it up for the camera. Oh yeah. Take every advantage I can get to rep. So it's 7:05. We'll give it a minute. Just make sure we get as many folks as we can in before we get started. Yeah, then we'll take it away. So put the agenda in the chat one more time. If you haven't already, please sign in using the sign-in sheet at the top. Maybe you can use this time to kind of go through and just talk a little bit about events. We have a upcoming strategy call for the Mid-Hudson Valley effort in support of the statewide Tax the Rich campaign. That's going to be on either Monday, December 21st or January 4th. We haven't quite decided if that Monday call is going to get rescheduled to the 4th or not. But the Zoom link is in the agenda and it will not change. So if you want to join us for that, feel free to save that info and join us. And got one more person coming in, so we'll give it just a few more seconds and then we'll get started. Thank you all so much for spending your Friday evening with us. It's great to have you. Okay, apologies. This was all, as you can tell, very ad hoc here. Get that permission adjusted for folks.
Technical difficulties.
Hey, there's always going to be technical difficulties. That's what it is to be a DSAer.
Right. Zoom.
Okay. All right. Everyone should have edit access now. Thank you for pointing that out. All right. So I think we can get started. We got 20 folks on the call, which is fantastic. So our event tonight, Why Eco-Socialism, is a three-prong presentation on various aspects of the climate crisis and an argument for why we need an alternative to capitalism to properly address the crisis at hand. So we're going to have three presentations tonight from three presenters, each of which are members of our chapter's Eco-Socialism working group. Each presentation is going to be about 10 to 12 minutes long, and then we're going to move into a Q&A for about 20 to 30 minutes so that folks can ask questions and we can engage in a really wonderful discussion, hopefully, about some of the topics that we're going to be covering in our presentations. So with that said, I think we can get started. I am going to share my screen real quick. And we'll go to our first presenter of the night. So just to confirm, can everyone see my screen? Okay, wonderful. So, all right, so with all that said, I'm going to pass off to Dan Atona so he can take us into the first presentation of the night. So Dan, it's all yours.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm Dan Atona, he, him. I live in Montgomery, part of Eco-Socialism, like Michelangelo said, and I'm co-chair of Electoral. Both of those are great groups if you are looking to get involved. So I'm going to start by giving a quick summary of climate science. It's stuff you should have learned in 6th grade, unless you went to school in Texas. And then I'm going to talk about eco-socialism and solutions to the climate crisis. Next slide, please. So this is from the EPA. It is a chart of greenhouse gas emissions. GHG is how I'm going to, it's like the thing I'm going to use in the slideshow. You can see over 80% is carbon dioxide. There's some smaller ones. Methane is a notable one. That's where like all the stuff about cows producing methane causes greenhouse gas. You might have heard of that. Next slide, please. All right, if only it were that simple, but it's not. Next slide, please. So this is called the Keeling Curve. Scientists in Hawaii have been tracking CO2 emissions in the atmosphere since 1958. And all this greenhouse gases are trapping the heat inside of the Earth and warming the planet. If you remember from the pie chart, it was like over 80% of the greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide. So they're tracking that. And as you can see, it's been going up every year since like the 50s when they started tracking in Hawaii. Next slide, please. I like this chart because it shows how the global average temperatures are going up. What I like about it is not that the temperatures are going up, but that it shows that it's being tracked by multiple like organizations. There's NASA, there's a Climate Research Institute, Berkeley Earth, and their numbers are all slightly different, but the general trend is the same, that since people have started tracking temperature on Earth, it has been going up. Next slide. Yes, so climate change is bad. I know you sometimes hear like the term 2 degrees of warming, talk about like this danger zone that the world doesn't want to hit. But according to a climate report in New York, we've already had more than 2 degrees of warming here in New York State. We've seen sea levels rise more than a foot since 1900. Over half of New Yorkers live on coastal counties. And Noam Chomsky's called climate change a threat to all organized human life. And that is, yes. If you've ever seen, there's a picture of Noam Chomsky where he's holding a little gnome that someone made of him. Yeah. But anyway, that is not an exaggeration, what he said. This is like a serious problem, and it's not just a problem that affects human beings. Climate change is also one of the drivers behind the 6th mass extinction. Means more wildfires in the summer, more ticks, more mosquitoes, more death from heat strokes. This is not a good thing. Next slide, please. Green capitalism will not save us. So, they sell you this idea that like, a carbon tax, which will like, influence the market and will fight climate change, or you just got to buy some metal straws, or you got to buy a reusable bag. It's like none of that stuff is going to solve the problem. Batman, he's a scientist, but no scientific innovation is going to like get all the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Like we cannot depend on that stuff to save us. We have to look at where the problem's actually coming from. Over 100 companies were responsible for over 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions since 1998. And, while Poor people struggle with rising sea levels. Rich people ride around in super yachts. This is the class divide. This is, and so basically any solution that leaves the class structure in place cannot solve the climate crisis. Capitalists will always put profit over planet. Capitalism got us into this mess. Capitalism cannot get us out. Next slide, please. Ecofascism is also bad. So ecofascism is like a hypothetical authoritarian government that, tries to protect the environment by any means necessary. But that is not the solution to the problem. That won't work, and it would result in mass death. Something that eco-fascists like to use is this story called lifeboat ethics, and it's this idea that like if there's a lifeboat and only a certain number of people can get on, then the humane thing to do would be to keep other people from getting on so as to not drown everyone. And in the story, they describe it as like you want to cut off people's hands so they can't get onto the life raft. And they try to analogize this with Earth, but that assumes that that the planet can only support a certain set amount of people, and that we've already hit that number, and that you have to take drastic actions to stop that. And that's just not true. A UN report says we have more than enough food to feed over 10 billion people. We're not close to that right now. And we have more than enough money to give everyone a dignified life. So, what they envision is a world where, they build a raft and they put all the rich people on it, and then they keep all of us off. And they come up with, and then they use that as an excuse to wipe everyone out. Not good. Next slide, please. Like I said, there's more than enough money. It's just in the wrong hands. That red line is the top 1% wealth inequality in the United States. The bottom line is the bottom 90%. So we can build a green economy. We can build the solar panels we need. We can build the wind turbines we need, and we can give everyone a healthy, happy, and habitable planet. We just need to tax the people who have the money right now. Next slide, please. Greenhouse gas emissions by sector. So this is important for just noting transportation, electricity. But my point here is that individual choices cannot cause system change. For example, about 2 years ago, I made the choice to become a vegetarian just because I felt like it was the more humane thing to do. And I did feel bad about my impact on the world in terms of because agriculture is 10% of carbon emissions. But my individual choice to become a vegetarian cannot change the carbon, output of a giant sector like agriculture. It's not going to move that alone. The only way we can move something like that and affect, how much carbon is being emitted is through the working class uniting and bringing these systems under democratic control, because all of these systems are controlled by a very small group of people at the top. And you or I making an individual choice to carry a reusable bag or do a reusable water bottle will not fix that. That doesn't mean those things are bad. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do them. It just means it's not going to create the system change that we need to stop climate change. Next slide, please. I couldn't let it go by without including a Marx quote. Marx was, using the term man to mean humankind, which has fallen out of favor for good and obvious reasons, but I'll just read the quote anyway. Man lives on nature means that nature is his body, with which he must remain in continuous interchange if he is not to die. The man's physical and spiritual life is linked to nature means simply that nature is linked to itself, for man is a part of nature. People are not the problem. We are part of nature. The problem is our mode of production, which is capitalism. That's what's driving this. The desire for profit is what's causing the ecological crisis. Next slide, please. A modest proposal, eat the rich. So there are more than enough resources on Earth for everyone to have a dignified life. But right now there's a small group at the top that hoards everything. The capitalist class and their corporations are the ones to blame. We need a wealth tax redistribution, a Green New Deal to build up our clean energy capacity, free mass transit systems, public power, and so much more. Next slide, please. And this is what eco-socialism is trying to save us from. This is a cartoon from the New Yorker. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. They will always, capitalists will always put short-term profits over the health of the planet. It's what they've always done. It's what they will always do. The only way we can fix this is by, abolishing the current class structure. Socialism is the answer. Next slide, please. Now, those are just works cited. That's all. Thank you, everyone. Oh, so at the very end of the three presentations is when we're going to take questions. So just hold them in your brains, and then we will answer your questions.
So Dan, I actually have a very brief request. Is it possible for you to take the links from the cited work and just put those into the agenda so that folks can dig into some of the stuff that you cited for the PowerPoint?
I don't have a link to my brain, but sure, I'll put that in.
All right. So thank you so much, Dan. That was great. Next up, we're going to pass to Sarah Hanna so she can take us into presentation number 2.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to try to tackle a somewhat broad topic, which is the dichotomy of humans versus nature. Let me see if I actually, oh, there you go. Okay, so humans are obviously at the receiving end of the threats posed by climate crisis. It is very much a problem for the species, but as we all know, the conversation around the environment often tends to be framed as a problem of the species and not just for the species. Another way to think about this is the question, what must be done about climate change, can very easily transform into a much more sinister question, which is what must be done about humans. So this kind of thinking goes back to roughly the mid 17th century. This is when, the culture was changing a lot. When René Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, it was an implication of the human mind as sort of this primary vehicle for judging everything outside of us, right? So the environment, other species or whatever, they may just be a fragment of imagination or whatever, and the one certain thing was the human mind. And the way this thought exists in this dualism or dichotomy tends to emphasize parts of a thing as separate entities instead of thinking about it from the perspective of the relationship between those things. And this kind of thinking was developing alongside the scientific revolution of this era. This was being made possible by previous technological advances, for example, mining in Central Europe that led to availability of metals, which meant production of equipment and knowledge was advancing. And what happens in this kind of thinking is you externalize things that you can understand and quantify and measure. And because you've demystified it, it becomes something you can control. And, everybody knows about greed and the profit motive of capitalism, but I do think there's also this kind of seduction happening with yourselves, what you can do, what you can figure out, what you can decode. And suddenly, you don't need answers from higher powers, and nature becomes one of those things. You can measure it, you can quantify it. That means you can also control it. So I think that there's this seducing going on that leads to the development of capitalism as a modern way of doing things. The Anthropocene is a term that was introduced in early 2000 by geologist Paul J. Crutzen, and it's an old term, but he reintroduced it to mean an era where human influence on the planet was so so impactful that you could see as a distinct layer in the geological record. And he suggested that this era be placed roughly at the latter part of the 18th century. But when we say human influence, we obviously ask which humans, right? Because we know, and we have known for a while, that it's not all humans. The richest 10% contribute a staggering 52% of the emissions. The poorest 50% have contributed 7%. We also know it's not all humans across space. United States has a giant lead in fossil fuel consumption, sometimes way more than an entire continent. And we also know it's not the same across time. Like, so what happened in the latter part of 18th century? It's not like we suddenly changed physiologically and became a different species, right? So what changed is the way we started doing things, which is capitalism. Capitalism is not an economic system. It is not a social system. It is a way of organizing nature. And what does nature include? It includes everything. It includes relations that humans have with each other. It includes, family structure. It includes relationship with other species, how we measure time, how we quantify things, how we see the limits of the planet or not see the limits of the planet, and how we use the very long and expensive work done by nature as a very cheap resource that's kind of for the taking. And this organizing is what enabled capitalism to come into being at around this time. So it kind of sounds like it shouldn't be called the Anthropocene because it's not anything to do with humanity itself. If it's to do with capital, then world ecologist Jason W. Moore has suggested the term the Capitalocene, which would be a historical era shaped by relations that enable an endless accumulation of capital. So the correct dichotomy, or the more accurate when we're talking about the climate crisis, would not be humans versus nature. It would be capital versus nature, specifically the way it's organized nature. It represents nature as external, time as linear, space as flat. Again, these are very kind of like things that can be divided easily, measured easily, and that's how it comes under the control of a capitalist process. So what would it look like if it's not humans versus nature? The more organic position is, or the more as-is position is humans in nature. And this is the very opposite of that kind of like a linear organization. This is messy. It's a ceaseless cascade of digital transformation. And it's just a big blob of kind of like a web of life where there's multiple feedback loops. We exist as a species. And like all other species, we make our environment, and then the environment makes us. The other species activities affects us and we affect them, vice versa. So like just the existence of humans as a living thing is not, not the issue in this picture. And these positions have been mapped in the area of conservation. And it looks something like this. So you have the capitalist and the post-capitalist. Then you have humans in nature and humans versus nature. Right here we have mainstream conservation, which is, the traditional people versus park kind of a thing where capitalism goes on as usual, but you create a little bit of separation from human activity and nature so that you can try to preserve it. And, it has been known to have, considerably failed. Even UN has acknowledged that it's not really working. Then there's a more extreme version called neo-protectionism, which is critical of capitalism, but its solution does not involve addressing capitalism. Instead of that, what it does, it kind of fortifies the separation between humans and nature to such extreme degrees that it would be, huge swaths of so-called pristine wilderness completely separated from humans. And right here we have something that's been called new conservation, which is capitalism friendly, doesn't really see it as a problem. And its emphasis really is on redefining what nature is. So in this, kind of thinking, nature is not necessarily just pristine wilderness. Maybe it's also like weeds that grow on sidewalks. So it just kind of changes the perspective on what nature is. And then on the bottom left, we have the sweet spot. It's been called convivial conservation as proposed by Bram Busher and Robert Fletcher. And they see, capitalism as the source of the problem in conservation. So their solution, first and foremost, involves challenging capitalism with a political, ecological idea. And then the goal would be to create a system, basically to reorganize nature, as we would say, so that things can coexist alongside each other. If we roughly mapped those positions to broader climate crisis positions, this is just my rough attempt. We have green capitalism that we're familiar with. And then maybe the extreme version would be, some kind of technologically advanced feudalism where a free market has been compromised so that there is a system to hoard the available resources for just a few people. And then maybe there's a version of capitalism that's also hyper-technological, but that has redefined nature. I don't know, maybe like in this case, like augmented reality can count as nature or something like that. And then on the bottom left is our leftist political ecology. It's where something like eco-socialism would fall. And it's again where we see capitalism as the main driver of all of these problems. When we say organized nature, it's not just the soil and the atmosphere, it's also inequality. It's also what we have moved from the domain of rights to commodities and things like that. So what would it mean for us to reorganize nature? What would our utopia look like? So first and foremost, a reminder that everything that seemed impossible once, is impossible until it's possible. So just, I know this quote goes around, we live in capitalism, its power seems inescapable, so did the divine right of kings. And neoliberalism also was a utopia at some point. In the early 20th century, these guys thought they had a crisis of their ideas, and lots of people told them that their idea was impossible, impractical, and they are said to have borrowed the idea of utopia from socialists, who were, of course, their enemies. And what was their utopia? It was to establish a world economy that was protected from national governments, who, of course, have to answer to democratic pressures at home. And they also wanted to position humans as citizens of global market and to reframe human rights as the universal rights of capital and goods. So this is, this is basically the world in which private property is human rights. So this is just a fun thought exercise I did for myself, mapping neoliberal progress against the chart of fossil fuel consumption. In the early 20th century, it's just ideas, and they're, trying to make it possible, floating it around. And then World War II happens and shifts the power dynamic considerably. Britain stops being the powerful empire. America starts taking on the role of this like informal empire that's very much trade-based rather than territory-based. And then in 1995, they get a version of what they had wanted, which is World Trade Organization, kind of a government that lives above the level of national governments, and of course oversees world trade. So what is the leverage point in challenging that world order? Well, first and foremost, the United States is a leverage point, because at the center of this neoliberal world order is America. Everything happens through the US dollar, everything happens via Wall Street and Washington. So it's hard to, start to chip away at the system without looking at American politics. So if you zoom into American politics, this is not by any means a complete visual, but just to give you the idea that all these separate movements are, nodes of the same thing when we talk about reorganizing nature. This has kind of a push and pull dynamic, and one, progress in one thing has like kind of a multi-directional domino effect in other things, and that's exactly what we want to happen. And also a quick reminder that, we have seen big climate events in the past in human history, and they have always changed the structures of power and production. And it's, the situation is more dire now, but it's always helpful to see this as a historical process, because if you don't, then you get into this doomsday narrative, which can be very dangerous because it can quickly spiral into right-wing talking points or ecofascism, like Daniel was saying. For us as organizers, the way to think forward and to move forward is to see this as the historical process, as that messy web of life where you can have multi-directional domino effects with some progress in the leverage points. So with that note, shut down a coal plant and you can slow global warming for a day. Shut down the relations that made the coal plant and you can stop it for good.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah Hanna. So I'm going to share, we have someone entering the call. So I'm going to share my screen for the final presentation. Let's see here. Exit, present. All right. So the final presentation today, we're going to look at a very specific kind of single case scenario of eco-socialism playing out in public policy and how it directly relates to what's happening right here in New York State. And furthermore, as the title says, looking at how New York State can be a model for the nation. So, why public power? We have maybe 8 years left to really make a difference here. A speed and scalar approach to planning is needed to meet climate goals set by not only international bodies, such as the International Panel on Climate Change, but just even our state goals. Many of you know the state recently passed the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which has quite a few pretty broad goals for the state in terms of where and how we can meet climate targets such as zero emissions by, I think, 2040. In general, it's great, but it lacks a lot of teeth. So a lot of what we're talking about in terms of public power is how we get to those goals. So the investor-owned utilities are failing to address the need to decarbonize the grid, and they're raking in record profits while ratepayers have been stuck with the bill and environmental costs for expanded fossil fuel infrastructure, right? The investor-owned utilities are not meeting the challenge, right? Their interests do not lie in preventing climate change. Their interests lie in making a profit, as both Daniel and Sarah Hanna have pointed out in their presentations. And public power is not just a single campaign for any single bill and or just public ownership, but it is really a long-term movement building campaign. It is about energy democracy. So it's about building a long-term movement of democratic and civic engagement. It's about bringing people, ordinary people, into civic governance. So this year, the Public Power Coalition of New York, a coalition that the Mid-Hudson Valley DSA is a partner of, is going to be introducing 2 bills, one to tackle generation and one to tackle distribution. So some of you may know, but for those that don't, the New York Power Authority is the largest publicly owned utility in the country. And one of our bills that we're introducing this year, the generation bill, is designed to expand some of NYPA's powers. So NYPA is responsible for about 25% of New York's energy generation, 70% of which is renewable, mostly New Deal era hydroelectric up north. So that includes some plants on the St. Lawrence Seaway, as well as Niagara Falls. One of the great things about NYPA is that it's budget neutral. It finances all of its projects through the issuance of bonds, which means that, going into a legislative session where the state budget is very much a huge issue and a big concern, and, DSA is supporting tax the rich. We obviously have a huge fight to raise revenue in the state of New York, but one of the best aspects of addressing NYPA and trying to expand some of their powers is that it doesn't actually impact the state budget. So NYPA actually is in a really good position to be, central to our move to expand renewable infrastructure in the state of New York. So the statewide legislative campaign to expand NYPA's powers kind of orientate around a few things. So the bill has something that we call the right of first offer and refusal. Basically, this would allow NYPA to get first offer on new proposals for renewable infrastructure projects. So if the state of New York wanted to build an offshore wind farm, we would basically, through this legislation, NYPA would have the ability to get a first pass on the bid for that contract. Whereas right now it would have to be, mostly private investors, and or some kind of a private developer coming in. This would allow the state itself as an entity to pursue these projects. It would also allow for the acquisition of existing renewable infrastructure. So, one of the things that I think is very important to kind of lay out here is that so much of the problem that is kind of caused not just by fossil fuel infrastructure, but even by how we kind of respond to this crisis in terms of the planning around renewable infrastructure, is that there's no centralized planning for it. So taking more of that infrastructure under state control means that we can have a more planned design philosophy behind how these renewable infrastructure projects are put forward. And the other aspect of this bill that's really important is that it eliminates entirely the energy service companies. Now, ESCOs are kind of like the sales arm of the investor-owned utility in the private sector. They mostly are kind of like a transactional point of service. So by getting rid of the energy service companies, we're eliminating, basically, you can think of it like as how right now we have a private insurance market. This would eliminate a lot of those market incentives. So all of this to say that NYPA can assist with the COVID recovery as a green jobs creator. All of the jobs that would be created under these new infrastructure proposals would be either prevailing wage or union jobs and contracts. Which, especially in the midst of a COVID recovery, the need to create jobs in the state that pay well is going to be really important. There's also the opportunity to rapidly expand renewable infrastructure across the state, right? Going back to this 8 years left, right? Like we have very little time to address the climate crisis. So our ability to really spin up large scale renewable projects is paramount to our ability to meet the crisis. And then also, one of the great things about this bill is that there's a mandate in the bill to require the state to decarbonize all municipal and state-owned properties via mandate in the bill, which means that, both transportation, public buildings, colleges, all state properties will have to be transitioned to renewable energy. And there's a roadmap that SUNY produced to how to get there that this mandate will follow. So it's going to be like a very much so like a statewide effort to kind of start laying the foundation for what that looks like. And this newly expanded NYPA will also have support from a newly established Office of Renewable Energy Siting, which is managed through the New York State Department of State. Oh, apologies, my slideshow is glitching out. And this is important because it's an office that's dedicated to developing proposals for new renewable infrastructure projects. So when the CLCP asked, ORES basically was established to create a body that would help to determine how new renewable projects are cited. So we want them to work with NYPA to have a really powerful state arm in developing and implementing new renewable projects. So transitioning now to the other side of the equation, which is distribution, we want to take back the grid, right? So this is what public power and public ownership is all about. So our statewide distribution bill creates a pathway for a public takeover of the investor-owned utilities. So, it's no small feat, and the utilities are going to cost a lot of money to take over. This is one of the reasons why we're pushing for things like tax the rich, right? We need a lot of money to be able to buy out these utilities, but it's in the interest of the public and it's in the interest of the country, of the state, to take them over so that we can really prioritize renewable infrastructure. It's also important that this bill redraws a lot of the gerrymandered and somewhat problematic utility service areas that exist now, and they will create more representative, democratic, and accountable utilities and utility service areas. So one of the things that we're looking at is, a lot of the existing utilities were, in the maps rather, were drawn based on both the flow of electricity, but also on the acquisition of a lot of smaller utilities over the years. So, now we have like really large utilities like Con Ed and National Grid that are made up of a lot of subsidiaries. And the goal with this redrawing effort is to kind of understand not where the grid has been, but where the grid needs to go, and how we can make a more accountable and more democratic service area, or rather service areas in the state, to kind of achieve some of these goals that are very technological in terms of how the implementation is achieved. This bill also establishes democratic governance structures to oversee these to be established utility territories. So, one of the things that I've been doing as a partner in the coalition has been doing some research on developing proposals for democratic board structures that will oversee these new utilities. And we want these boards to be accountable to civilians. And part of that is that we want ratepayers to literally be on these boards. So ratepayers, workers, so folks who represent unions and public sector workers will, and civil society, so groups like DSA, justice groups across the board, so environmental justice, racial justice groups, they will all have the opportunity to serve as representatives on these boards of trustees to have direct decision-making power over these utilities. So this is, again, going back to energy democracy, right? This is about a long-term project to bring civil society into democratic governance. It's also going to establish progressive rate structures that eliminate the profit motive and reinvest in communities in a just transition. So, rates right now are designed around achieving maximum profit and return for the investors. And the idea behind new progressive rate structures is that we may be able to design rates that incentivize higher efficiency. New York State has terrible efficiency in the grid and in old homes that are really energy inefficient. So by developing progressive rate structures that are maybe akin to, as an example, there's some really great rate structure proposals in Washington State, specifically in the city of Seattle, that really incentivize improving efficiency. And in fact, the utility itself allocates a certain amount of funding on the municipal level to help retrofit buildings that may be energy inefficient so that they have better efficiency standards overall. And that brings the cost of electricity down, not just for the utility, but for ratepayers, because once it's publicly owned, it doesn't have that same profit incentive. It doesn't really matter anymore how efficient the utility is, because that burden of cost is no longer on the ratepayer. So the other thing that's really exciting about this is that it's not just these boards that are going to have oversight. One of the things that's happening right now in New York State is there's a really intense amount of litigation happening over the Long Island Power Authority. And out of that, SUNY and CUNY is helping to establish a public power observatory that will provide oversight over what's happening down in Long Island. And we want that same observatory structure to have statewide implications. And this will be a pipeline through state schools to kind of take academics and experts and bring them into the oversight process to provide expertise on the governance structures for these utilities, but also the implementation of infrastructure in general. Okay, so the big picture. So, we talk a lot in DSA about the Green New Deal, right? It's a really big campaign nationwide. But I think it's important to also kind of look at what's happening in New York State and realize that a lot of the statewide legislative campaigns that we're fighting for right now, like public power, the New York Health Act, public banking, taxing the rich, housing justice, that all these things are really an echo of what is in the Green New Deal resolution, right? The Green New Deal calls for healthcare for all, housing for all. And we have the opportunity in New York State to pass legislation that would achieve a lot of those victories on the state level. And trickle down economics is BS, but there, this idea of trickle up governance that like New York State can influence other states across the country and set precedent for how legislation can be drafted, that is significant. And it's really important to point out that state coalitions lead policy research for federal legislation in part. So, public power right now, the research we're doing is being supported by a UPenn climate collaborative that is headed by Thea Ria-Francos, who's one of the national committee chairs for the National DSA Eco-Socialist Working Group. And the research that we're doing alongside them is going to be used when drafting recommendations to the incoming Congressional DSA caucus. So again, this is like very direct, right? Like research that's happening right now on state policy is going to be potentially the basis for federal legislation. And that's really significant. And of course, leads to similar state level initiatives across the country. This is really a synthesis of like, taking something local and regional and statewide and then translating that into the national. And it's very important to point out that, the terrain that we're playing on right now is very disadvantageous to the movement, right? We don't have a very friendly federal government incoming, right? The Biden administration is not going to they will probably do some stuff to mitigate climate, but it's not going to be in the spaces that we want. Sarah Hanna and Daniel both mentioned the limitations of green capitalism. That will very much be programmatically what the Biden administration will try to sell us most likely. So it's really important that we can, on the state level where we have a supermajority, we have a pretty sizable caucus of progressives and members of DSA in the legislature, that we may be able to achieve some of these wins, even if it's a long-term goal of like 5 years, even if we get to a legislative victory in the next 4 to 5 years, that's going to be very significant in the national fight. So yeah, and all that to say, Hudson Valley DSA is a member of the New York Public Power Coalition. We do really good work, and we are extremely busy right now drafting bills for this legislative session. So that ends the third and final presentation. I think we have at least 25 minutes. We can go a little over, a little past 8. So I will be taking stack. Basically, the way this works is if you want to ask a question, just type stack like so into the chat, and we'll make sure you get your question answered. So yeah, if anyone has a question at this time, just put stack into the chat, and we can make sure you get heard. Julia.
Hello. Thank you for that presentation. That was really, that was awesome and really thorough, and sort of opened my eyes to a couple of things. I'm not usually an eco-socialist person, so I don't really know much about this. And I was wondering, I know you all have been doing a lot of like reading and thinking about these issues, and I'm curious to hear, beyond the public power initiatives that Michelangelo brought up, what are some of the things that you foresee the DSA chapter focusing on in like the next year or so, in terms of organizing everything from like, the political education we do like this to, legislative work? Like, where do you see the member, sort of like steering the members in terms of targeting?
Yeah, I could definitely answer a little of that. So I also co-chair our Eco-Socialism group alongside Sarah Hanna. So public power is definitely, I think, probably our lead legislative campaign, but we are also supporting organizing efforts for the National Fracking Ban Act, which is the ban on fracking that AOC helped introduce. And I think we're going to probably start trying to figure out how that fits into some of the national organizing that's happening for the Green New Deal campaign. Which, suffice it to say, I don't have all the answers on that. I think the terrain of a national campaign is very different from a state level campaign. On the state level, outside of public power, there are a few other bills that are being introduced this session in the environment space, namely the CCIA, which is a cap and trade bill that's being introduced by the New York Renews Coalition, which is a coalition we're also a member of. I don't necessarily know if we're going to be supporting that based on our capacity, and also I'm not the biggest supporter of cap and trade. It's also I guess it's like a carbon tax, so it's there's mixed feelings I think within environmental movement spaces in New York State about how that bill kind of fits into the narrative, but I think our main focus is definitely on public power. It's long term, and yeah, we're also part of the Stop Dan Scammer Coalition. So a lot of our work locally is going to be very much centered around local, fights on infrastructure, ending fossil fuel infrastructure in the region, and that does tie into a larger narrative about public power too, right? We can look at, again, I think Sarah Hanna had the slide about you can stop one coal plant, but it doesn't really address the problem that led to that plant existing in the first place. So, even if we get a win on Dan Scammer and we put an end to that specific campaign, the elements that led to that taking place, even after the passage of the CLCPA, so it shouldn't even be possible for that to happen right now. Those conditions still exist. So, providing legislation that really kind of addresses the underlying condition is where I think a lot of our focus is. And I think Dan wants to jump in there.
Yeah, I mean, the New York City DSA chapter, which is very much larger than ours, like one thing they always do is anytime there's like a pipeline that pops up, they immediately jump on it. Like their Eco-Socialism chapter is all over that, because that's something that people can immediately understand. Like they're trying to run a pipeline through your neighborhood and poison your kids. It's pretty simple. it's pretty, it's easy for everyone to grasp. So, anytime we see an opportunity to fight a fossil fuel project, we want to be a part of that. And if that's something you're interested in, you should definitely join the group. Right now we're trying to plot out a bunch of stuff we can do for 2021. So this is the perfect time to join if you're not involved.
Sarah Han, I see you have a direct response too.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, with, eco-socialism, I think it is one of those things that, like, we often talk about how the problem from every other thing kind of culminates in this, climate crisis. So I think, like, I think that we've been talking a little bit about collaborating with other working groups because, there's so many overlaps. And I think that with all of the things that different working groups do, I think it still feeds into, the overall goal of what eco-socialism wants to do.
Yeah, definitely. I'll mention for folks who may be new to the chapter or just, jumping on this call, Mid-Hudson Valley DSA is a very holistic organization. We don't really have like siloed projects, although we kind of do, but for the most part, every project we take on involves members from working groups of other parts of the chapter, whether it's our electoral group or culture working group. So a great reason that I think DSA is a really strong organization politically, not just here in the Hudson Valley, but statewide and nationally, is that we are so multifaceted in our critique and our analysis of the issues that it leads to a very holistic kind of approach to how we get solutions. So Matt, you are on stack.
So I have two things. I just want to say Sarah Hanna, Michelangelo, and who was it? Dan, I believe, that had the presentations. Great job. It was very informative. One, will you share the presentations that you guys had tonight? And two, I work locally with some individuals in Newburgh with Next Step Hudson Valley. And I was wondering if you guys with the Eco-Socialism had any connection with the PFOPs and the pollution from DOD with the Newburgh water, and if you had any comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely aware of so for answer your first question, in terms of the presentations, I don't think they're available yet, but we can definitely make those available and maybe make an effort to get a link out to them in our weekly newsletter that we send out or something like that. And then specifically on the water issue, we haven't done a lot of organizing on that. We do work with groups like the Newburgh Clean Water Project, who have really centered that issue on a local capacity in the city of Newburgh. But I think it's really a matter of capacity. We're a small group. We're a small chapter to a certain degree. And I think the number of projects we can take on is really also a factor of how many people are involved in the working group. So, I would say that, for those who want to get more involved in that specific issue of a local, environmental crisis surrounding the water contamination from Stewart Air Force Base, I would say consider joining our meetings and bringing that to meetings to figure out how we can organize on that locally. Yeah, to Dan's point in the chat, join us. Dan, I think you're on stack.
Yeah, I have a question for Michelangelo and Sarah Hanna. How did you two get so smart? And can you teach me?
No, I'm not that smart. you just gotta read.
Twice your age.
Oh, I don't need help being beautiful. I just need help with the smart thing.
Didn't you know that your brain just gets bigger as you grow older? Just kidding. Any other folks want to jump on stack? We have at least another 10 minutes or so we can take questions. Oh, thank you. Seeing people come complimenting on the presentations means a lot. Definitely appreciate that.
I think Nicholas is on stack.
Thank you. I missed that. Nicholas, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much for the presentations. I was wondering if you had any, because eco-socialism is such a multi-intersectional, as it should be, critique of capitalism and solutions. Many different solutions are proposed. Obviously, democratically managing society, not for to sustain life and the caring economy. But are there any ideas of rethinking modes of production and relations of humans to other humans that you're excited about or think that we could explore on a local, regional level?
Sarah Han, I don't know if you want to take that one.
I think that, yeah, I think that like, I personally find difficult to think about those things at a local level, just because it feels like, you know, if it's not a large sweeping arc over everything, that's how my brain works anyway. I would say like, I'm the least locally informative person in this group. But I do think that, you know, like some of the things that the pandemic has shown, for example, in terms of all of the things that we thought were, you know, requirements in our life, not being the case as it turns out. What's important to us, you know, turns out to be not what we thought, etc. I feel like, especially with eco-socialism, because I think that it's one of those areas where people can feel intimidated, just because it's hard to know what is what, you know, like people don't want to be overwhelmed with like all the technical aspects and stuff. So I feel like there's a lot of room in terms of, you know, events like this, like education, because, you know, if people don't know what something is, then obviously they're not going to know that they want to change that thing. And I think it is important for us to start talking about things like doomsday narratives and ecofascism, because that's where people first go when they're frustrated. You know, you can kind of see why they go there, because you look around and you think, oh my God, like, why are people so stupid? Or like, why are people, you know, making all these wrong decisions? And it's an instant emotional reaction that can, you know, turn into a very dangerous form of politics. So I think that, yeah, I think there's a lot we can do in terms of just demystifying this whole, you know, of area of politics. I think that even the name eco-socialism, you know, like is not, you know, absolutely familiar or something. So yeah, I personally feel like there's a lot of work we can do, especially with existing groups in the area, as well as with other working groups, like I said, to, you know, to demystify this whole thing.
Yeah, one other thought on the production question. You know, I think thinking specifically around like production as it relates to renewable infrastructure, you know, the sourcing of materials. I think there is an importance on like localization, right? Like a lot of carbon a lot of the carbon that's released is because of you know, aspects of trade, right? There's like a really brutal amount of pollution just from shipping, you know, air freight. Like that is a factor. However, I do think like when looking at the sourcing of the materials for renewable infrastructure, what's almost more important is thinking about how like we offset and make more equitable the carbon budget. So, you know, looking at countries in the global south, for example, like Bolivia is a really great story around the pressures of, you know, international markets to kind of seize and take control through imperial forces, their lithium production. So a question must be raised, like, you know, no one country, no one geography should be responsible for the production of materials that are incredibly environmentally polluting. But these are also materials that need to be sourced and used for, you know, to get out of this crisis, right? So figuring out like a global process of managing those carbon budgets so that it is equitable and it is offset in a way that is, you know, has human rights centered foremost is, I think, also really important. So I don't necessarily know if production, I think in some ways it probably makes sense to localize, but and I think one of the areas we would probably focus in terms of localized production would be food, honestly. Not just the import and export of agricultural commodities, but thinking about how we can better centralize and localize food production to eliminate a lot of the carbon, you know, carbon release created through, you know, what is it? Dan's presentation earlier, right? It's like 10% of the carbon budget is agriculture. So I think like, yeah, figuring out how we can like localize some of that stuff is probably the best way to address it. Julia, you're on stack, but if it's okay, just because we're getting close on time, I want to go to Tara first, and then we can go to Julia after.
You can kick my question to the end if you want, because it's Like, I have two questions.
It's
I'm
okay.
curious where you find the like line to thread between like democratic socialism, regulated capitalism versus owning the means of production, because as Sarah Hanna said, like capitalism itself causes idiocy in terms of how stuff is distributed. So that's like one question that I have, and my other question is like particularly on the CCIA. I lobby for New York Renews, and I'm curious what you guys think about just like you'd mentioned it as a cap and trade scheme, and I don't think it's a cap and trade scheme. I think it's just a fee on people that are using fossil fuels.
It's like a pollution tax, I think, right?
It's a pollution tax. So I don't know, depends. One side of things never wants you to use the word tax, and then but then it's pretty straightforward that it is a tax. But anyway, that's different from cap and trade, and I'm not I see the DSA is like stretched thin, doing awesome work. Thank you all for doing that work, for building support behind the ideas of socialism, public medicine, just a lot of great stuff. So I'm not saying like, oh, you should be behind CCIA. I'm just wondering if you have any more nuanced information on where you're at with that. I'd be interested.
I can answer the second question first and then pass to Sarah Hanna to answer the first. So yeah, like we're definitely not against the CCIA. I think it's really a limitation of like how many legislative campaigns we can take on in a given year. I think we're supportive of it. I don't have that nuanced of a perspective on the CCIA, in part because I haven't spent a lot of time researching that legislation. I expect that if we do not get a significant budget reform through the tax the rich proposals that have been issued by DSA this year, that we would probably be looking at the CCIA for some other means of revenue for some of the work that we want to do in this legislation. But maybe this is also an opportunity where we just need to have more conversations with New York News folks. We joined recently, we haven't been super involved. So Tara, if you DM me your email in the chat over private message, I'd be more than happy to have a conversation.
Will do, thanks.
Yeah, my pleasure. Sarah Hanna, if you want to kind of address that first question about the threading of the needle.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I personally feel like, at this time, we have to consider short-term solutions as well as long-term solutions, just because so much is at stake and the impact on people is so immediate. But at the same time, the problem with green capitalism, or solutions that involve tweaks to capitalism, like compassionate capitalism, etc., is that, in my understanding, I think the math just doesn't add up. Like, not only do we have to make a huge push to transition, to like a huge green transition, but then we also, at the end of that, have to get into something like a steady state economy where things are not driven by basically a growth chart, because I guess essentially what drives capitalism, and I just feel like as long as the solution is also attached to profits, and I feel like it's never going to be the right solution. And we've run into a lot of problem by historically building on compromise solutions, which of course is difficult in a giant country like this with some people of so many background and things like that. But it feels like the crisis does demand that we once and for all make the right solution, instead of the solution that everybody can makes each party happy or something like that. So for United States specifically, I guess we need a big almost like war effort level of a green transition, and then we need to in this country, you know, which is leading all kinds of charts in terms of how much it's contributing, we just need to change the way we live. We have so many things that just don't make us happy, you know, and we have such a lack of things that do make people happy. Time being a huge thing, you know, like, you know, families are miserable because they can't see their kids, they can't spend time with their kids, you know, people are doing so many jobs, you know, overnight nurses have to leave their kids with other people. It's, yeah, it's just a lot of bad structuring to make very few people happy. And if you look at, you know, the chart of when capitalism started, it just feels like, you know, that wasn't too long ago, and there's absolutely no need to keep doing this. It has produced so many crises in such a short time. And now I've reached a point where I feel like, what is the one good reason to keep it? And it seems like there really isn't any, except this kind of intuitive feeling that this is a, you know, a permanent thing that can't be changed.
I'll say, you know, regulations are going to be necessary, but if you leave the class structure in place, they're always going to be broken down, because capitalists will always seek to destroy the regulations that they think are in their way of their profit. Like, you know, in the 40s, we were on our way to building a social democracy here in America, and capitalists destroyed that. They destroyed those programs. They beat up the unions. So, you know, capitalists are always going to get in the way of any kind of reform you try to make. And so you just got to get rid of the capitalists. And Nicholas mentioned you got to take the carbon out of the air. Yeah, we're definitely not against like researching that kind of technology, but it's just we don't think that like you can depend on that to save us. And, you know, capitalists are always going to try to sell you on this idea that like, oh, you know, like in a couple of years we'll have a technology that'll fix all our problems, so don't worry about it. But that's just not true. We have to worry about it. We have to do something now.
Yeah, real quick on like the carbon sequestration component, like at least the little research I've done on that has shown that it's rather carbon intensive to sequester carbon out of the atmosphere mechanically. There is, you know, I think there are better ways to sequester carbon organically, regreening efforts, you know, kind of eliminating like monocrop culture, you know, large agriculture projects like, and just agriculture in general at that scale. Those methods have been proven, I think, to like show, you know, pretty substantial efforts in terms of the carbon sequestration conversation. But I would definitely not target it in terms of like a technological solution. I don't necessarily think that that's going to be viable within the time frame we have left. It's like that whole conversation, like, okay, like, could we go to Mars in like, you know, escape Earth within the time remaining before the planet is uninhabitable? And like, the reality is like, no, that's what we don't have the time to build enough rocket ships to make that happen. That's that lifeboat, you know, metaphor that Daniel was pointing to. So Nicholas, I believe you have a direct response, and then I think we'll close Stack because it's getting late, and we'll go to Julia to end the call.
Yeah, I just wanted to like bring up, you know, we're talking, I guess for me that, you know, a few important things to remember: that capitalism doesn't require democracy, and that one of our largest emitters is the U.S. military and imperialism. And so, and our, you know, global trade. I mean, does it make sense? You know, do we focus production in countries with low labor rights and you know, murdering of union activists because they're, you know, exploited labor, you know, and we take resources from other countries and steal them for capitalists and other places. So, you know, we're never going to be able to get, you know, and then we have the whole issue of feminism, the gender binary, and other issues that also capitalism, I guess what's the right word, uses to further exploit and oppress us. So without getting rid of private property, because as you know, the biggest deal is that we have enough stuff to go around. We have especially enough housing and basic needs to go around. It's just not properly distributed. So, you know, we can in the short term, like Sarah Hannah was saying, in the short term, I think, you know, command and control strategies, like you cannot do this, you cannot use this pollutant, you can, you know, just to put some brakes on harm is, I don't know if that's, I think that's what Sarah was saying. I don't want to mischaracterize your words, Sarah. But that we should be mindful that we have to go further than that. Thank you.
Yeah,
go ahead, Dan.
I definitely agree that we should always be mindful in any like policy area that any improvements we make here in the United States are built on the on the empire. We are the evil empire that the world hates, and we've talked about it in our meetings, and Sarah Hanna does a good job of bringing in international perspective. But like any green technology that the United States develops, we have an obligation to share that with the world for free to like all the countries of the world, because we have done so much horrible shit. Like, and also there's no way to fix the climate problem. You can't just fix it just here in the United States. It has to be done around the world. And, the lower income countries shouldn't bear the cost of fighting this problem. I know Julia had the last question.
Yeah, real quick though, I would just say that going back to this needle of can you reform capitalism, or does an alternative need to be established? Internationally, no, we'll definitely go to you, Julia, if to close out. Internationally, I think one of the concerns, definitely something we've talked about in our group around the Green New Deal, and I think this is a very big vulnerability in the progressive left. So not the socialist left, but maybe your more Warren camp kind of leftism. Is that it generally is, we've heard calls for greening the military and establishing a more nationalist kind of approach to climate policy. And, that is a very slippery slope towards ecofascism, because it is not globally addressing the issue. So, I do think that there are just inherent limits in the market in terms of how you can address the crisis at scale. And it does require very careful planning and, equitable models for countries that bear the burden of production for a lot of the resources that are going to be required to achieve a just transition. I think that starts here, but it is something that has to be borne out in the national policy and then in international treaty. All right, so Julia, I think you have the last question if you want to close this out.
Okay, I feel almost weird because you guys just gave this beautiful broad summary, and now I'm gonna ask a weirdly specific question. But I was curious to hear more about the jobs question, because I think that this is something that comes up a lot in this region. And, obviously they're potentially putting that new Amazon warehouse in to Fishkill or East Fishkill. And so I was curious to hear how, I guess more detail about how you might talk to someone about this at their door, in terms of specifics, in terms of what kind of jobs there would be with the public power stuff, what kind of training programs. I'm having a hard time sort of conceptualizing how that would go down, and if there even is a plan. Maybe there's not. But yeah, just more detail on that part would be great.
Yeah, that's a really difficult question, because even now in the coalition, the labor component of the legislation is very much something that's in development. It's also very difficult to get labor to the table to have very sincere discussions on what they want in the bills. That's proving, there's just political friction with labor in general. It's very difficult to kind of reach consensus in that space. I would say, obviously the bill is targeting prevailing wage and union contracts, specifically with the NYPA bill. So there is, at least in legislation, we're doing everything we can to enshrine labor protections and labor standards into the legislation. There are limitations in New York State labor law that kind of, prohibits some things for being in the bill. We can't guarantee that every job created under our bill proposals would be union jobs. There's again just stupid limitations in New York State labor law. That being said, I think one of the things that we're discussing is, and I think comes back to the unique aspects of DSA as an organization that is grassroots organizing organization, is that we do need to have a certain amount of labor organizing involved in this, and just approaching rank and file and having conversations with them about them organizing themselves, but then also getting them to lobby on their own behalf for policies that are in their self-interest. So, one of the points of tension that we've kind of had in the Hudson Valley is, having some discussion with the trades here about public power. And, statewide, the Utility Labor Council, which kind of represents all of the IBEW locals statewide, came out against public power last year. And it's complicated because a lot of these locals see themselves as the utilities. There's a very entwined relationship between labor and capital. And disentangling that is, I think, something I don't have all of the answers for, but I do think that it is very much so has to be part of our base building tactic and how we communicate these policies to people. But it's also, I think, we've been having a lot of some of these, and Eli and Sarah Hannah can both chime in here, but we also have been having a lot of these discussions in our labor working group about how, I think there's an intersectionality to a lot of this. And this goes back to that whole holistic domino effecting that Sarah Hannah talked about and that others brought up tonight. But I'll go to Sarah Hannah, and then we will close out with Eli with a direct response.
Yeah, I just want to say that the labor aspect is definitely absolutely the number one holdup in terms of, kind of like something like the Green New Deal not being like a huge bottom up push. And, the situation right now is that the reason people are not receptive to these huge changes is because every basic service that should be a basic service is something that they have to fight for themselves. So I think covering the basic services is absolutely the entry point, into this kind of domino effect that we talk about, starting with healthcare, and, maybe even education, debt cancellation, housing rights. I think, if you have, a country full of insecure, traumatized people, it's very hard to, sign up for a huge change. So I think that is absolutely the entry point, is that people should feel like, they're going to be safe.
Eli, go for it.
I feel like a big way of making sure that people feel safe, especially folks in organized labor, is to stress that labor be organized. This was something that kind of came up for me during your presentation, Michelangelo, when you were talking about NYPA guaranteeing either union or prevailing wage jobs. I can, from the perspective of, say, the IBEW, I can definitely understand. I mean, then at least our local is pretty reactionary, but that's beside the point. I can definitely understand them seeing that distinction as a threat. And, just from the perspective of, a rank and file worker, if they're, you're giving me prevailing wage today, you're putting me in a position where I work for the government, and if I strike, I'm holding up this effort to save the world. I think that's a serious thing to be addressed.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's also hard, right? Because I think limitation, not just from leadership, but also even rank and file to a certain degree, is that by coming out in support of public power or lobbying for public power, they're putting themselves directly in the crosshairs of the utility, which is their employer. So that's a very difficult dynamic in general, because we're kind of asking them to jeopardize their own security potentially in the transition. So I think figuring that out is definitely our point of tension right now in the coalition, and one of our largest focuses in terms of research and outreach. Luckily, we have some great legislators who have been helping to start secure some meetings with groups that are invested in the broader research around renewables in New York State and how we can transition labor into that work. I think someone asked about retraining projects, and both in NYPA and in the distribution bill, there will be in these like new mechanisms and in new regulatory systems, there will be retrainings and direct representation, not only for workers, but also for how we retrain and bring workers into a renewable market. So that I think is the last. Oh no, sorry, Daniel, you have a direct response, I think.
Yeah, something we've talked about in our meetings is, one of the ways where New York State government has been like, oh, we're going to create green jobs is like they'll give tax breaks to some company, like they did for the solar city or whatever that was up in Buffalo, where they gave it like millions of dollars of tax breaks, and they're like, this will be solar jobs for a bunch of people, and then it just did not work out. And like people hear about this happening, they know that like workers are being promised jobs and then getting burned, and like we just can't let that happen if we want to earn workers' trust and union trust. So like what Sarah Hanna said earlier, it's going to have to be like a giant mobilization, like on like war effort levels, and it's going to have to be like direct government created jobs, just building up industrial capacity for like wind turbines and solar panels and stuff like that. We're bringing the jobs back, but for real this time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and actually, Nicholas, it's funny because it turns out NYSERDA is one of the better tools in some of like the retraining stuff. Like we're looking at NYSERDA hubs to be part of. Anyway, it's all way too specific and in the weeds now. Sorry, folks, I'm a wonk. So I don't want to keep folks any longer. We've already lost most of the folks on the call. I am going to. Oh yeah, and Carolyn. If you want, please DM me your email. We've had onboarding discussions with Lower Hudson Valley DSA and Nassau DSA, and we definitely want more DSA chapters statewide participating in the coalition. So if you want to get involved with that, I can absolutely have an onboarding discussion with you, and we can talk a little bit about what involvement looks like in the coalition formally. One other ask I want to make of folks on this call, I'm putting a doc into the chat. We had an action last Friday where we asked our members to call, and just people in general, to call Sean Patrick Maloney and Antonio Delgado, demanding progress towards the Green New Deal in the form of federal spending for public power. So, funding to help take over the investor-owned utilities in the states. Presumably that would be part of like the $2 trillion that Biden has proposed as part of his climate plan. And then we're also asking them to support, I want to get the bill number, HR 5857, which is the Fracking Ban Act. So in the document that I just put into the chat, there are phone numbers for both Maloney's office and Delgado's office. If you're feeling emboldened after this meeting, their office is technically open until 9 o'clock. So please do not hesitate to give them a call and or call them next week. We're trying to just get calls into their office so that they know that this is something that their constituents care about. So yeah, if you can support that, that would be fantastic. And I think we will leave it there. Lastly, if anyone wants to get more involved with our chapter, please don't hesitate to email us at organize@mhvdsa.org. And we'll definitely reach out and plug you into some of the work we're doing. Jack, you have a DR, and then I think we'll close out the meeting.
Yeah, I got an email today that Delgado has his 50th town hall tomorrow. It's being streamed Facebook. Does anybody else have that information, or do they want me to post it?
Post it.
Okay.
We should try to get people at that town hall and heckle them about public power and the Fracking Ban Act. Yeah, and Dan says put it in the Slack. Yeah. I know we already closed this meeting out like 10 times. But yeah, Jack, that's good info. Get that on the Slack, and let's try to get some folks to that town hall. I think that sounds like a good plan of action for the weekend, maybe.
Magical.
All right. Thank you all so much for staying on and participating in this conversation tonight. Yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to close out, but I think we've definitely gone over. So thank you all so much. And yeah, until next time, take care, stay safe, stay healthy.